I was pretty sure it was going to be a waste of time, but at the insistence of a member of my team, we took off one evening from our work among the poor in rural Nicaragua to attend a Rotary Club dinner in Managua, which is in the big American hotel right next to the only shopping mall in Nicaragua. My friend loved his own Rotary Club here in Springfield so much that he was certain that if only this Nicaraguan Rotary Club knew about the work that we were doing in rural Nicaragua, in those impoverished villages in the jungle, that they would want to jump in and help us. I watched as he desperately spoke to an indifferent gathering of Nicaraguan first families, all of them well-dressed and wealthy. And he told them about how his club in America wanted to work with their club in Managua, and together they would raise aid for the poor of their country. But you could not have cut the indifference in that room with a chainsaw, even though I thought about trying. The businesswomen and men of Managua do not want to think of their country as being poor, and many of them have actually never strayed into the countryside of their own nation. The coffee they drink in the morning, the fruit and vegetables on their dinner table are being produced in virtual slave conditions not more than a 2-hour drive up the Pan American Highway from Managua, but they will never see it and they do not want to hear about it. They do most of their shopping in Miami. They live in gated communities in Managua, and the army keeps the Sandinista peasants from ever protesting in the streets of Managua. I have seen on several trips huge encampments of poor Sandinistas just 30 or 40 miles north of Managua. I think they were camped out when you were there with me, Linda, weren't they? That on the Pan American Highway, they gather up in the mountains of Matagalpa and they form a camp on the Pan American Highway where they're visible. And every few days, they move just a mile or two closer to the city, threatening the government if they don't begin to provide services, if they don't begin to create greater justice, that they may march all the way into Managua and start a war. I've seen this in other countries as well. I saw it in Ecuador, where the Quechua Indians gather up in camps in Otavalo and move down from the mountains towards the capital city of Quito. They never go all the way in because it would be a bloodbath if they did, but they always want their government to believe that if they don't try to improve conditions, a war could still happen. I was reminded of those encampments last fall when the Occupy movement was gaining attention in the United States. CNN's very beautiful business correspondent, Erin Burnett, launched her new show Out Front during a time when she had to walk past the Wall Street protesters on her way to makeup and wardrobe to get ready for her appearance on TV. She looked in the camera in her very first show and said, "What do these people want?" And even when the issues of income disparity and the use of public money to repay what amounted to virtual gambling debts on the part of investment bankers had been explained to Erin Burnett, she looked right into the camera and incredulously said that the whole problem is that the protesters don't understand how economics work. Of course, Burnett grew up in an affluent family. She was engaged to one of the leading executives of Citigroup, who received a huge bonus in the banking bailout. And I'm sure that the people who received those giant bonuses genuinely believed that they had earned it because they had invented devices and oversaw manufacturing and growing of crops. And actually, they hadn't done anything at all, had they? They didn't produce a thing, but felt like they were owed millions of dollars. When the classes grow so far apart that one cannot even see the other one anymore, then low wages and low standards of living among the poor actually make sense to the rich. It's offensive to think of rich people living in Managua while the poor live like slaves up in the mountains just north of them. But the distance between us and the people who produce our shoes and our clothes and who harvest our fruits and vegetables, just because there's a few more miles added to it doesn't change the morality of it one whit. Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski sat on the set of their popular morning news show talking both about Mika's publication of an entire book about her salary negotiations, knowing your worth. She was very emphatic about how there was a huge gender disparity between what she was being paid and what the men sitting at the table were being paid. But at the same time of the publication of her book, she and Scarborough both talked about Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor's attempts at breaking the labor unions in that state, and both agreed that teachers and firefighters were going to have to be more realistic about what they were expecting in compensation. Now, Scarborough and Brzezinski kept their actual salaries pretty secret, but other talk show hosts, who are not nearly as popular as they are, all make over $10 million a year. And that list includes Matt Lauer, Katie Couric, Brian Williams, Diane Sawyer, Meredith Vieira, and even Bill O'Reilly makes $11 million a year. Brzezinski could talk about that gender gap with legitimacy. At one point, Joe Scarborough made 14 times as much as she did, but she still had to have been making over $1 million a year, and literally said that the cost of childcare, makeup, and clothing was taking all of her money. Bill O'Reilly threatened to just quit, to just retire, if Obama allowed the tax cut on the super wealthy to sunset, because if he had to pay any more in taxes, it just wouldn't be worth it to him to keep working. Now, he's keeping $8 million a year for what he does. But the fact that Bill O'Reilly would quit if we raise the taxes is the strongest argument I know for raising taxes. Anything we could do to get him to shut up is worth whatever it costs. The premise that underlies Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is that all that had to happen for Scrooge to change was to actually see the lives of the poor, of the sick, of the homeless and the hungry. And I would like to believe that that's true. I'd like to believe that most people, if they would just leave their Rotary dinner, if they would push back from the makeup counter and actually go out and see that school teachers oftentimes have to take from their meager salary to buy supplies for their own classrooms. And to realize that the guys and women who run into burning buildings that other people are running from are not lazy. They are not greedy. They are willing to risk their lives, oftentimes to save just our property. And they spend half of their work week sleeping in the firehouse, isolated and away from their family for years and years and years. And so they have an expectation to retire with some dignity, and yet we're told that that's greedy. We're told that the people who pave our roads and build our bridges and paint our houses and cook our food are lazy because they want health care. And a lie told and stuck to, as Mark Twain says, becomes as good as the truth. That you tell that lie over and over and over again, and people actually start to nod their heads like it ought to be true. It is not true. It is not true. Now, simply being introduced to poverty doesn't change everyone. There are people who just have a cold, hard place where their heart was supposed to be. And yet, I don't want to worry too much about those people, because I think most people want to be decent folk. But there is a separation between the rich and the poor in our culture. The older neighborhoods, even here in Springfield, have big houses and small houses side by side. But as the automobile became ubiquitous, we built houses together within a certain price range. Entire neighborhoods are built to a scheme where only people of a certain income class will live in that neighborhood. Air conditioning took us off of front porches. We don't even put front porches on houses anymore. Cable TV pushed people into the back of a family room under air conditioning where they never even see their neighbors. Most neighborhoods these days don't even have sidewalks. We don't see one another. We don't interact. And so is it any wonder that we don't understand, we don't sympathize, we don't care that people who are providing services to us do not get to live like human beings? The people who actually own most businesses live nowhere near them. Or they maybe don't even know that they own it. I have a pension fund with the church. I have no idea what the pension fund invests in. Every few years we get reports, and I've got other things to read. I don't trouble myself with that. But a lot of us have investments in businesses so that anonymous ownership means that the owners never have to know that some of their employees are lined up at cross lines trying to get an extra bag of groceries to make it to the end of the month. They don't know which of their employees come to work ignoring chest pains because they cannot afford to see a doctor. And they couldn't afford to miss work even if they knew what was wrong with them to seek treatment. In our very familiar scripture passage today, the prophet is speaking to people who are leaving behind being slaves in Babylon to go and rebuild the nation of Israel. And the prophet says, "They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat of the fruit. They shall not build for someone else to live in it. They will not plant for someone else to eat it." The media derision of the Occupy Wall Street movement was that it was a bunch of lazy bums who wanted a handout. They couldn't hear that what they were asking for was an opportunity to work for a living wage. The American dream that was once articulated in a Revolutionary War era, and it was attributed at times to George Washington, to Thomas Jefferson, or John Adams, but it said, and I'm quoting directly, it's male again, I'm sorry, "I am a soldier so that my son can be a farmer, so that his son can be a merchant, so that his son could be a poet." There was among us a dream that if you worked hard, if you tried, if you saved, that you could change your station in life, that your children could have a better and more meaningful life. But if people who are bankers who move money around from instrument to instrument without ever actually producing anything, or people who are nothing but pretty talking heads on TV can make millions of dollars while we insist that the people who build our roads, who grow our food, who deliver our mail, who teach our children cannot afford to retire, cannot have access to housing, cannot have access to medical care, or can even afford to educate their children, then the American dream is a farce and a lie. How can the richest country in the world even consider creating an economy in which people work full time and still live in poverty, still can't have a place to live, or food to eat, or medical care, or transportation, or any reasonable hope of retirement? How could we even be callous enough to consider it, especially in a country full of churches? 400 churches in this city that is as anti-union and low salary for workers as any place in America, and if that doesn't scream hypocrisy, what possibly could? No one should be ashamed to ask for a living wage in exchange for a lifetime of service, but our nation should be ashamed that they have to ask. I have no problem with people being economically successful, but their success cannot mean that the children of public servants cannot even afford to send their kids to state universities, so that the children of the rich can afford to go to private colleges. I think people who are clever and talented and inventive and frugal probably deserve a bigger piece of the pie. They just don't deserve the whole pie. And the church that thinks that the good news to the poor is that they get some pie in the sky when they die by and by, they need to dust off their Bibles and realize that the good news to the poor means that they not only build houses for rich people to live in, but they build a house they get to live in themselves. It means that they don't just plant vineyards and stomp grapes to provide wine to the 1%, but they themselves get to enjoy the fruit of the vineyard. They don't just move from one migrant farm job to another, digging potatoes, picking apples, or harvesting grapes, but they also not only get some bread, but they get some roses in life too. If we have to keep a third of this nation in poverty so that the 1% can live in a way where they never have to see the poor, then capitalism and democracy have failed the moral smell test. Most of the world's great religions began with a leader who became radicalized by the suffering of the poor. There have always been ancient religions that were royal religions, but the great religions that have survived into our era all started as religions with a concern for the poorest people in the society. It began that way for Buddha, for Zoroaster, for Moses, for Jesus, and for Muhammad. Peace be upon them all. They were all advocates for the poor, and they each didn't survive to see it, but each one of them had their reform movement co-opted by governments, taken by governments, and used to keep the poor in submission and to keep them in poverty. None of the world's great religions were royal religions. They were movements for justice, particularly justice for the poor. And I insist that's what we all ought to be right now. Several years ago, Barbara Ehrenreich, a journalist and a novelist, accepted the journalistic challenge of going around the country and taking various entry-level jobs, minimum wage jobs or startup jobs, and seeing if she could figure out how to survive on her salary. And this book, Nickel and Dimed, should be a book that every pastor and every churchgoer in America should read. We should read this account and understand what it's like to be on the bottom rung of the ladder. While she was working in a retirement home in Maine, Ehrenreich had a Saturday evening off, and she decided to visit a revival that was going on in a Deliverance Temple tent that was near the apartment where she was living. She wrote a pretty long description of it that's quite prophetic, but I want to read just a paragraph of it. She says, "The preaching goes on, interrupted with dutiful amens. It would be nice if someone would read this sad-eyed crowd the Sermon on the Mount, accompanied by a rousing commentary on income inequality and the need for a hike in the minimum wage. But Jesus makes his appearance here only as a corpse. The living man, the wine-guzzling vagrant, the precocious socialist, is never once mentioned, nor anything he ever had to say. Christ crucified rules. And it may be that the true business of modern Christianity is to crucify him again and again and again so that he can never get another word out of his mouth. I get up to leave, timing my exit for when the preacher's metronomic head movements have him looking the other way, and walk out to search for my car, half expecting to find Jesus out there in the dark, gagged and tethered to a pole. Men and women, I say that it's time that we stop crucifying Jesus. It's time to cut him loose from the tent pole. It's time for us to turn to the good news for the poor and turn that message loose on our nation, and to stand with laborers and public servants, cooks and janitors, the people who wipe the chins and wipe the butts of our nursing home patients, the people who wipe the noses of our children and spend long hours with them every day trying to make them literate. It is time for us to bring good news of a living wage to the checkout clerk at Walmart and the taxi driver at the airport. Do not dream of justice in the next world if you don't have the courage to demand it in this world. There is not enough of heaven to make up for making the poor live in hell in this life. We must not be silent. We must not stand idly by.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverend.drray@aol.com for more information.